Hi, this is just going to be a short breakdown of a single sound that I made for my recent sound redesign of the Battlefield 2042 Hazard Zone trailer. Just this sniper shot here, which I'll let you hear the final version of now. And I've separated this sound into 4 parts really: the tail, the transient slash body, the kind of kick, which is the low thump layer, and the mech layer as well. Starting with the kick layer, I've used these impacts from a Thompson gun that I thought had a very clean low end, and isolated that with some EQ along with bringing out a little bit of the fundamental. And because the shot is kind of in 2 parts, I've used 2 separate recordings, one a bit further away and one a bit closer, to have a clear distinction between the more and less powerful parts of this transient that I'm also highlighting, with one being quieter and one being louder. But you can see there's more kind of detail in the second one because it's a closer hit. Onto the transient slash body layer, I'm using 2 separate takes of this Sharps rifle, panned a little bit to give it some separation, but not too much because ultimately the shot is happening in front of the camera and in front of the person holding the rifle, so it wouldn't make sense to have it too wide. And on these, I just have some EQ cutting the rumbly lows, as well as a little bit of a boost to the highs. Transient master, just accentuating that initial transient, and track spacer, sidechaining it pretty heavily to the second part of the impact, just to make sure that it's very clear the 2 parts are distinct. Otherwise, the second part of the transient could get masked by the tail of the first, and I wouldn't want that. But I still want to keep the tail of the first, because when you put all the tails together, it makes it really characterful, I think. Next, for the second part of the impact, I have this pitch down recording of just the very start of a Remington rifle, which is just giving it that initial thump with some reduction in the lows but not an outright cut, as well as a bit of boost to the highs, which then pairs nicely with this vintage volley gun, which again sounds larger than life, adds to it being a cinematic rather than gameplay, so you can go a little bit more out there with the sound, especially since this is the only gunshot in the entire scene that I redesigned. So it makes sense to have it be as powerful as possible to really convey that it's a big force of power within the scene. And on the volley gun, I have some EQ boosting the lows to accentuate that kind of boominess and low transient of it, as well as a little bit to the highs to increase the kind of rasp. And because the recording itself doesn't have a whole lot of highs, I'm reducing the width a little bit to 33% because it is a stereo recording and it is quite wide on its own. And then in terms of effects on the whole body layer, I have track spacer at the start, side chaining just the lows below 125 Hz to the kick to make sure that the kick delivers the nice clean transient in the low end that the original recordings don't really have. But because it's only sidechained to the kick, once you get into the kind of body and tail end of it, the lows come back and give you that power that the kick can't really give you on its own. Again, some transient master just to accentuate how powerful it is. A bit of EQ cutting the very low rumble and this annoying resonance that I found but couldn't quite figure out which element had the resonance, so I just cut it on the whole stack. Then to give it some character, I have supercharger, doing a bit of compression with a slow attack and release to make sure that the transient really comes out, as well as a bit of saturation just to beef it up and make it a bit bigger. Isotope trash only affecting the mids so that the highs and lows don't get too kind of noisy and washed out, but making it a bit more boomy and dangerous, with the mix only on about 25%. NC17, just a little bit of compression and distortion in one, only using a little bit of it because I tend to overuse it on things and it's already kind of compressed and distorted, but just combining multiple different types of distortion, each at a very low percentage, I think gives it a more characterful and unique sound than just having one distortion be turned up to like 70 or 80%. And then at the end of the chain, I have the same track spacer instance duplicated to make sure that all the compression that we did just then isn't taking away from the side chaining in the low end that gives it the nice clean transient. And the transient slash body layer sounds like this without effects. And here's how it sounds with all the effects. Onto the mech layer, this is all made with real gun recordings and is again quite kind of complex in a way that you wouldn't really have if it was a gameplay recording, because I wanted to really accentuate how intricate the gun is. And because the actual shot in the scene of the sniper firing is very short, I wanted to cram as much sound into it as I could to really convey how powerful it is without having to do kind of some ridiculous pre-life to the shot, which I didn't think would be that realistic. So to start with, I just have these two recordings here of an AK-47 and a Glock to kind of represent him rearranging his grip on the gun a little bit, or the gun just moving in his hands. And then this shot from a grenade launcher to kind of represent the trigger pull that you don't necessarily see, but that I wanted to come through in the sound because it makes the shot even longer if you have, you know, this kind of mechanical pre-life and then the longer transient and then the big tail. I think it really adds a lot of interest to the sound. Then these three Glock layers kind of simulating the mechanics of the gun as it's firing and a little bit after. Again, making the sound more complex and also adding a bit of interest in the highs that the gun recordings don't quite have because they can tend to be a little bit distant, whereas all these are very close to the ear and it really makes you feel like you're hearing it from the sniper's perspective. And finally, this pistol shell eject, which has kind of a very high ringing, which again is kind of a bit over the top because you don't even see a shell come out of the sniper. But I just thought it would add a little bit more interest, and that's mixed very low in the mix because high resonance hits like that can be quite piercing if you have them loud enough. So it's more there as something you feel rather than something you really notice and catch on the first listen. Altogether, the mech stuff sounds like this. Finally, the tail is brought in with a fade so that the initial kind of tails from the transient gun recordings don't overlap with it and make it too loud just after the shot. So it has the kind of correct overall waveform that I like. This is a tail from a Barrett, so a real sniper, which I thought that was the most important to get it from a real sniper, whereas the other recordings I think can be from other guns as long as it still sounds okay. And that actually has the lows boosted because I know that it's not going to be interfering with the lows of the transient or the tail, so it can infer a bit of power so that even after the gun has been shot, you still feel a bit of rumble, which I think makes it sound a lot larger than life. And finally, this layer is really fun. It's the tail of a dynamite explosion, which had these really nice kind of pops that I liked, which sounded a bit like thunder, which I'm layering quite subtly underneath the Barrett sniper tail, pretty far after the actual shot to kind of make it seem like you're hearing the transient bounce around, even though there's nothing for it to really bounce off of. Because the scene has moved on at that point, you more feel it subconsciously as a kind of these extra little transients rather than noticing it. Because directly after the sniper shot, you'd see people getting hit with it, which kind of means that I have to shift the focus of the sound quite quickly and you can't really dwell on the tail as much. And finally, in terms of effects on the entire gun stack, I have some EQ boosting the lows and super highs, just to kind of give it that super powerful sound. Some compression with a slower attack and release, just to make sure we squeeze everything we can out of that transient and make the waveform a bit more uniform so that you hear the initial tail a bit more. Limiter, just boosting the volume a tiny bit. And then track spacer, which is being sidechained to the next scene where you see the bullet connecting so that that really takes center stage in the mix while still allowing me to have this nice long tail. And then a utility, making sure that the bass is in mono and also doing some automation so that the width of the entire gun sound is kept very narrow in the lead up and then widens out for the actual shot. And then something that I added very late into the process, I'm actually dipping the volume a bit between the two transients very quickly, just to make sure that there's as much distinction in the cadence as I can. Because what I was noticing is that even though I was making sure that the second transient cut through the tail of the first, the space in between them was kind of as loud as both of them because the initial body of the first transient didn't go down fast enough. So I just made this little gain cut by 14 decibels just very quickly. It doesn't go to silence, but it definitely gets quieter before the second transient, so you feel it a bit more. And that's also because the kind of powerful snipers from video games that I was referencing, like the HDR from Modern Warfare 2019 and the SMLE from Battlefield 1, if you listen to their transients, they both have cadences in two parts, and it goes pretty much to silence in the middle. I didn't want to do that fully, but I did want to reference it more. So here's the whole sound without any of these effects. Here's the whole sound with the effects, the final version. Thanks for watching.